Somalia has been a byword for violent chaos for more than 20 years. Since the government collapsed in 1991, it's been ruled by gun-toting warlords and become a haven for pirates and Islamic extremists. For the past 2 decades, the UN Security Council has imposed a complete arms embargo. Now, UN investigators are accusing a group of former South African mercenaries of breaching the embargo by helping train and equip a large militia force. One of the leaders has apparently been granted citizenship by the Australian government, allowing him to use Australian bank accounts and companies to run his ventures. Tom Cooks reports.
In a glamorous penthouse apartment on Sydney Harbour lives a man with a dark secret. His neighbours are wealthy merchant bankers and socialites. But Lafrus Leighton is a former South African mercenary and still very much in the guns-for-hire business. United Nations arms investigators want his assets frozen and for him to be subject to a global travel ban.
He's an unusual person in that he's an ex-special forces guy, and he became an executive of a mercenary group that ended up negotiating contracts with various governments.
The last 2 decades have been very good to Lafrus Leighton. As well as the penthouse, he's the half-owner of an apartment overlooking Sydney's Bondi Beach. And according to UN investigators, he controls a string of companies and bank accounts in Australia and around the world. When the ABC called at his Sydney apartment, Mr. Leighton was not home. But the places where he does business are far removed from his idyllic waterfront homes. For the past 2 years, he's been working in war-torn Somalia. There's been no functioning government here since 1991. There's no banking system, no border controls, and there's a complete ban on arms imports, enforced by strict sanctions imposed by the UN Security Council.
The sanctions are about a country that has already far too many weapons. It's about stopping them from reaching Somalia and also denying military training.
Is he going to ask what's expected over the next week?
Matt Bryden leads the Somalia Monitoring Group, a team of specialists appointed by the UN Security Council to investigate suspected breaches of the arms embargo. His team identified a complex web of companies called Saracen and Sterling Corporate Services that were hired to train and equip the largest militia group in Somalia. He found the company's operations were shrouded in mystery.
There were a number of large shipments of material, military or paramilitary assistance for the force. Saracen never sought to notify the council or to explain to the monitoring group what the nature of these consignments was.
The men behind Saracen and Sterling are mostly former South African mercenaries, and prominent among them is Lafrus Leighton. He's a former member of Special Forces in the apartheid-era South African Defence Force and went on to join a notorious covert unit known as the Civil Cooperation Bureau, or CCB. The CCB was responsible for a campaign of bombings and assassinations of political opponents of the apartheid regime.
Some members of the Civil Cooperation Bureau did commit acts of sabotage and did conspire to commit murder.
The Commission found that members of Region 6 of the CCB were involved in planting a bomb at the Early Learning Centre at Athlone in Cape Town.
During hearings of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Lafrus Leighton was named as the handler for a CCB assassin. The assassin was jailed for life after shooting dead an anti-apartheid campaigner in Johannesburg. After the collapse of the apartheid regime, Leighton and some of his former colleagues went on to form the infamous Guns for Hire outfit known as Executive Outcomes.
Executive Outcomes is what would be termed a private military company that hires mercenaries. Lafrus has been involved with Executive Outcomes from its very beginning. He was active in Angola, but also later in Sierra Leone. In fact, he was the one that provided the entry negotiations for Sandline into Sierra Leone.
A few years later, Leighton offered his company's services to help secure one of the largest copper mines in the world, in Papua New Guinea. The PNG government had been fighting a protracted conflict with rebels, which had shut down the giant Panguna copper project. In 1997, they struck a secret deal to bring in foreign mercenaries. It became known as the Sandline Affair, after one of the companies involved. When the deal became public, it brought down the PNG government, and Leighton's men were held under house arrest. At the height of the saga, Leighton spoke with the ABC's 7:30 program.
Ross Leighton, you've been in contact with your personnel in Wewak. Are you concerned about their safety?
Yeah, I am concerned about their safety. If the people of PNG or whoever there doesn't want us there, then we will leave immediately.
The mercenaries were eventually expelled from PNG, but Leighton made a lot of money.
His name also appeared as a signatory to a bank account in Hong Kong, where the Papua New Guinea government deposited some $13 million as part of the payments for that particular contract. These are definitely not transparent organisations.
Around 2 years ago, Lafras and his South African partners set up in Somalia. According to a report by the UN Monitoring Group, they were there to assist, train, equip and supervise security forces in violation of the Somali arms embargo. They built a force of over 1,000 men, equipped with planes, helicopters and over 80 vehicles. Somali tribal leaders and the South Africans training the force claim it's an anti-piracy coast guard, but UN investigators say it's an unaccountable private army.
The program is the largest scale military or paramilitary training program in Somalia, next to the efforts of the African Union peacekeeping forces in Mogadishu. The program has established what is essentially a private army.
Leighton is using a string of companies registered around the world, and according to UN investigators, Australia plays a central part in their operations. But Lafras Leighton's connection to Australia runs even deeper. The ABC has learned that in June 2009, he was granted Australian citizenship.
I would hope that the Australian authorities would at least be able to demonstrate on what criteria it was that Lafras got Australian citizenship. Was there an investigation of his past, including, his history back in South Africa in the apartheid period?
Australian records show that Leighton registered this company, Australian African Global Investments, in 2006. It has branches in South Africa, Uganda and other African countries, and is involved in logistics, transport and chartering planes and ships. The Australian company was registered by Taurus Financial Services in Sydney. One of the directors of Taurus, Gordon Hatch, also jointly owns property in Bondi with Lafras Leighton. Mr Hatch has told the ABC that he has no further involvement with Lafras Leighton. According to the UN report, Leighton is using Australia as a financial hub for money transfers in connection with his activities in Somalia. It states that around $2 million have moved through his corporate and personal accounts in Australia since the project started. The ABC has made numerous attempts to contact Lafras Leighton directly, without success. So it sounds extremely unlikely that he will appear on camera, is that correct? His lawyers declined an interview on his behalf, saying he was a private man who's extremely publicity shy. They claim the Somali militia force is a transparent, legitimate operation in line with UN resolutions to combat piracy in the region. But in their most recent report to the UN Security Council, the monitoring group labels Saracen's operations the most brazen violation of the arms embargo by a private security company, and they recommend that Leighton and his associates have sanctions applied to them without delay.
They have three parts. The first is a travel ban. Second is an assets freeze, and the third is known as a targeted arms embargo, which means that it's prohibited to deal in military equipment, weapons, arms and ammunition with an individual or entity that has been designated.
The UN Security Council has not yet decided on the recommendation for sanctions against Lafras Leighton and his companies, but breaching the embargo is a serious crime under Australian law.
Security Council sanctions are binding under international law, and Australia has pretty comprehensive formal legal frameworks in place in order to implement them in Australian domestic law. If it's an Australian company registered here or a person who ordinarily lives here and comes back from time to time, that obviously makes the person much more susceptible to law enforcement action here.
If the sanctions are adopted, it will be up to Australian authorities to enforce them, which could bring Lafras Leighton's operations here to a grinding halt.
We have engaged with the leadership of Saracen for the duration of the program, with their legal representatives, with the relevant authorities, supporting the program. And despite that engagement, despite the warnings and the advice that the monitoring group provided them, they persisted. And after almost 2 years of operations, the monitoring group felt that it was time to bring this to the attention of the Security Council and to call for action.